Hey there, drinkers, diners, and listeners. Catherine Cole here. Before we get started, I'd like to give a shout out to Blossom Brothers, the Four Top's one-year anniversary sponsor. Blossom Brothers botanical wine spritzers are made with just 4 natural ingredients with no added sugar, and you can find them in stores for $11.99 for a 4-pack.
Je pense sans cesse à toi.
Hello there, and welcome to the Four Top. It's a roundtable discussion of today's hot-button topics in food and beverage. I'm your host, Catherine Cole. Having just celebrated our one-year anniversary, we're going to mix things up today and run a retro show composed of outtakes from 3 pilot episodes we recorded back when the Four Top was just an idea. For our first course, we're joined by beer writer and certified cicerone Lucy Birmingham, Roger Porter, editor of Eating Words, a Norton anthology of food writing, and Laura Russell, recipe developer and cookbook author. Let's listen in as we discuss bad behavior in restaurants. Diners Gone Wild. Roger Porter, you were a James Beard Award-nominated restaurant critic for years. You know how to pick apart a restaurant, but how about turning your lens on other diners? What are your pet peeves when it comes to customer behavior?
Well, I was thinking about my grandfather the other day, and my grandfather would not have gone to a restaurant, even a modest one, without wearing a suit and a coat and tie. And he wouldn't have gotten on a plane that way either. Nobody expects that kind of dress code at just ordinary restaurants. But there are a lot of codes, I think, that people should follow. And the violation of some of these really bothers me. And I think the first one that I'd want to point to is treatment of waiters or servers. You often see in restaurants people doing things, I think, that are really quite obstreperous. People who don't realize that restaurant work is very hard work, and they treat servers in almost like what I would want to say, if this doesn't sound too much like an exaggeration, a kind of master-slave relation. People who snap their fingers or whistle at waiters or chase after them or expect a waiter to answer their questions when the waiter is speaking to another table. That kind of thing where people really disrespect the staff. And so that's my first pet peeve. I don't know if anybody else has that.
Here. Well, I agree with you completely. I think you almost have to consider the server as being on your team and as part of the whole experience. You know, they can explain to you what's in your food, and they can really, they can make or break your meal just as much as, you could ruin their evening by being a jerk. And, I'm almost always on the side of the restaurant in that case. Yeah. You really need to be polite.
It's interesting that you say they can explain what's in the dish. I have the opposite pet peeve sometimes. People who give you information when you don't want it, including their name. Servers who kneel. Now I'm attacking the server, not the customer. But the server who kneels down at your table as a kind of gesture of intimacy and tells you, "My name is Bruce tonight." Who needs it? And this is something the French, who I think are the great professional wait staff people in the world, would never do. So sometimes it's there's problems from the wait staff as well for me.
I've only experienced that once ever. I was at a restaurant and the waiter, the first thing he did was kneel down, right, like to be on my level. And I just was like, what are you doing?
Yeah, exactly.
I just looked at him like, I've never experienced this in my life. It was kind of odd.
Laura Russell, have you worked in a restaurant before?
I have worked as a cook, just in my externship right out of culinary school, but that was sort of a brief foray. But I do appreciate the effort and the work involved really in any job that goes on within a restaurant.
I was wondering if you saw those Jezebel, I guess it's a Jezebel blog called Kitchenette, if you saw the series they do called Behind Closed Ovens, where people who have worked in restaurants post the most horrible diner behavior, and then often it's how they got back at them.
Oh, like spitting in the food kind of thing.
Well,
that's the other thing, though. Why on earth would you be rude to someone who's going to be delivering your food from the kitchen?
It's not very smart.
It seems like a terrible
No.
idea.
I read some of those stories, and they were absolutely shocking. I don't know. I feel for these servers where people are taking out their aggressions. And there was a story on there about a 3-year-old at a table in a restaurant who was peeing in a cup, and his whole family was watching. And I mean, these stories are the extreme, right? Yeah. We thankfully don't usually see that in restaurants, but still, I was just absolutely shocked.
Lucy, your child would never do that, right?
No, he's perfect.
Well,
he's an angel.
I'm glad you brought that up, because I mean that's another pet peeve: people who bring their kids who are misbehaving, restless, crawling around, jumping up and down, and particularly when they bring them to, say, an 8 o'clock setting on a weekend when the restaurant's crowded, and they expect everybody to tolerate their kids yelling. I mean, there are ways to deal with that, I suppose. You rehearse something at home, and so the kid knows what good behavior is. I mean, at least it's an attempt. But,
yeah, I think, no one wants to go out to a restaurant or sort of deserves to go out to a restaurant more than someone with little kids. I mean, they're probably going crazy and dying for a night out. But, and having been there myself at one point, the minute you enter a restaurant with your young children, it is your responsibility to be controlling their every move. I mean, you are not the only people in the restaurant, and it's obtrusive to other diners and often really dangerous to the people who work in the restaurant if you're letting them move out of their seat and into, a place. So I do appreciate, I mean, my son was born in New York City, and I think he probably was in his first restaurant when he was about 72 hours old. And, we just set the stage early. Like there's a way you act in a restaurant, and, even if it was if it impeded on my evening, if he was loud or interruptive, then one of us had to go outside with him until he calmed down. I mean,
did you put salt and pepper on his pacifier?
No, he just seemed to learn how to do it. I think he learned to appreciate restaurants from a young age. This is a 16-year-old now who in a restaurant will say, can we have one of those for the table? He'll order our appetizers.
Sign of good parenting, Laura,
you still
definitely.
have, Lucy, you have how old is your son, 5?
My son is 5, and we also, my husband and I have had this philosophy of take him out as much as possible, expose him to restaurants so he can appreciate them and learn how to act. So, yeah, I've been there, and it can get a little dicey, but I agree. You're the parents, you're in charge, Right. Yeah, keep everyone else in mind.
I have 2 other pet peeves. One, people who stay at the table for a half an hour after they've paid their check.
Campers.
Yeah, right. Squatters. If you want to enjoy the company of the people you're with longer, then go somewhere else, have a drink or have dessert if you haven't had it. But don't hold up a table. It's really rude, unless nobody is waiting, or it's a kind of restaurant where you own the table for the evening.
So, Roger, my understanding is in Europe, you really do own the table.
That's usually true.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because people go late. I mean, Spain, people come in at 10:30 at night.
And the kids are in bed, I'm sure.
Well, sometimes, or they're very well behaved. I mean, the French kids really are terrific. They know. They've been brought up to be civilized, is the French word. My other pet peeve is people not. Well, I mean, I'm not a restaurateur, but on behalf of restaurateurs, people who have a reservation and don't show up, don't call ahead if they've had an emergency. I think it's really rude behavior.
Yeah.
Right. And I think there's probably very rarely an emergency. I don't think that's why most people aren't showing up.
Or they double dip.
They double dip. And that's what that bothers me in the sense that so many restaurants now don't take reservations at all. And I think that's one of the reasons, because it's not financially lucrative for them to book tables that people aren't going to show up for.
But doesn't that bother you? That bothers me so
it makes me
much.
crazy.
The
Well,
people,
I've never
the
thought
restaurants
about
don't
that.
take that restaurants don't take reservations.
Me too.
Let
Oh, that drives me
the
up.
music. Yeah, let them ask for your credit card number, something like that.
I would be thrilled to give
Yeah.
give my credit card number in exchange for a reservation. It's getting harder and harder. Everywhere. I've traveled a few places recently, but I think especially here in Portland, you want a business dinner, it's getting to the point where, there's 10 restaurants that will take a reservation.
Yeah.
I have an anecdote, and it connects with wines. I was in France several years ago, and a friend of mine from Portland came and we had a dinner at a 2-star restaurant, a very elegant restaurant. And she's a wine writer, and she began lecturing to the sommelier about the wine list. This is an extraordinarily wonderful restaurant, and she was telling the sommelier what kinds of wines they ought to have. I mean, it was really embarrassing, and that's client or customer behavior that was really beyond the pale. And I thought to myself, if this had been the French Revolution, she would have been carted off to the guillotine. But even after the head came up, she would have nevertheless been talking and giving advice with the head rolling in the dust.
Oh, my goodness, Roger. Just for the record, I do not do that.
No,
And now for our second course, let's sit in on a conversation on food cart politics I had with national food cart expert Brett Burmeister and Ivy Manning, a food writer for national magazines and the author of 6 cookbooks, and again, Laura Russell, author of cookbooks such as Brassicas, Cooking the World's Healthiest Vegetables. We are going to talk about food carts. And I know, if you want to tip at a food cart, you just drop a couple of bucks in the mason jar that's sitting on the counter there. But we're actually going to discuss the showdown between food carts and restaurants. So, Brett Burmeister, get us up to speed here. Are the food cart and restaurateur contingents banging heads, and how are cities reacting to the friction between these two groups?
So street food has become the big thing in the last 10 years. We started off with some new food trucks roaming around in L.A. and New York, and this idea of newly branded food trucks. And so once entrepreneurs and chefs, et cetera, knew that they could maybe do a food truck for $30,000 versus a restaurant for $300,000 in a city like San Francisco, they just started rolling out. And that caused problems. And a lot of cities immediately pulled up laws from back in the day, the 30s, the 20s, the 50s, that were written to restrict certain ethnicities from moving around in certain neighborhoods, meaning the Irish neighborhood didn't want the Italians to come in because the Italians were, selling on the street, et cetera. That's just
we
an
make
example.
an excellent beef sandwich. So yeah,
Right.
that's true.
But so they would bring up these esoteric laws that would then prevent street food vendors in the form of trucks or push carts, et cetera, from being in certain areas. A perfect example is New Orleans. For many years, the street food culture was growing there. You could not drive into the CBD, the Central Business District, with a food truck and sell. And you couldn't sell fish from a food truck. I mean, how just in one of the country's most culinary masterpieces of food, you couldn't do things in a food truck because of these old laws that were there to protect the restaurants. Fast forward. We have a lot of municipalities that are not necessarily the 15 major cities in the nation, but cities the size of Portland, the city the size of Kansas City, who are embracing the street food, embracing the food trucks, but they're working in order to find places for them. Flip side, you have cities like Chicago, who has a strong restaurant culture. Like, no. No to the food carts? No to the food trucks, no to the food carts. Because they believe it's going to take their business away. And
wait, so just to clarify, are they pulling up those old xenophobic laws and using those and sort of applying them differently because it's actually they're applying them for reasons of competition, not for reasons of being xenophobic?
Exactly. In El Paso, Texas, Institute of Justice did a study where the laws were written essentially you couldn't serve food within 50 feet of food. And really, it was a definition of like a health code individual. to what is that defined, and it could be someone's home. And so they created this map of where could you sell street food in El Paso, and there was this one like 50 square foot spot down in the south in a warehouse area where they could. And that was an example of how an organization like the Institute of Justice went to El Paso and said, you can't do that. Whether it's restaurants, whether it's everything, you can't do that. And they fixed it. But you get this anecdotal concern from restaurant owners on Main Street that is dead on a Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday night in some cities saying, if you bring in the food trucks, I'll lose my business. It's like, there's nobody on this street right now. Let's bring in some food trucks. And then you bring in food trucks, everybody comes down because food trucks are the latest thing. Have you been to a wedding lately? They all have food trucks. And you get this situation where you just need to convince restaurant owners that it's not going to take that business away. It's actually going to draw people in. But, it's an ongoing concern from, a restaurant owner that, hey, if somebody's parked in front of my building, those people are going to walk out and not eat my food.
Ivy, I'm curious what your opinion is on this.
I think it's more restaurants that have lunch hour or a breakfast hour where you're more likely to run to a food truck and grab a sandwich or something. But when I want to have dinner, I don't want to do it at a food truck. Honestly, it rains here. Yeah. And that's part of the reason I don't go to a lot of food trucks. There's sort of the problem of where are you going to eat the food that you just bought, even if it is sort of handheld. I'd like to sit down. So at dinner, I'm more likely to sit down and have a server and pay them 20% tip. And it's a totally different experience. Eating is not eating all the same everywhere you go and everything you do. So I can see that perhaps restaurants' lunch business is being threatened, but I don't see that there would be a huge threat to their clientele because I don't think the clientele is the same either for dinner.
No, and that's correct. You bring up a good point, Ivy, because here in Portland, we as our street food scene really blew up over the last 10 years, I did get a lot there was a lot of backlash from lunch-style places. The thing is, I was working and living in downtown, and the restaurants that were complaining were fast food. They were the really bad corporate deli that is just run by Marriott. It wasn't Bunk Sandwiches. It wasn't Higgins. It wasn't these good ones. And now Portland's unique. Portland is unique with its food. But even going to other cities, I have the people who are complaining are the people, honestly, who don't do the same quality of product as what's being offered in this new realm of artisan food trucks.
Wouldn't that be nice if there were food carts instead of fast food restaurants?
In downtown Portland, there is.
Yeah.
I agree. I don't think that carts are competition for brick and mortar restaurants for the most part. And it's exactly this reason of portability. I mean, if I'm downtown for lunch and I have limited time and I want to grab something, then I'm going to go to a food cart. If I'm not in the mood to sit down in a restaurant, what are your other options? Like you said, either I think the competition here is either fast food, you go to Starbucks and grab one of those little snack packs at the counter. I think it's much more of a grab and go thing that's the competition, not a restaurant where you get a menu and you sit down and someone's taking your order.
And I find it totally galling that cities, as you were saying, Brett, are trying to kind of almost legislate against the arrival of food cart culture, because to me it seems, I wonder what you guys think about this. To me it seems like food carts generate a sort of this beautiful urban landscape where you've got more people walking, you've got more pedestrians, you've got more people kind of sitting in public parks and eating. And I just feel like you don't have that feeling with delis and fast food joints. Well, it kind of brings people to the streets in a way. Can
I add to that? I did a very interesting interview with former Mayor Sam Adams in Portland, and he said that he saw it as a great way to lower the bar of entry for immigrants who had come to the United States, and a brick and mortar was way, way out of reach. But they could afford the $30,000 or whatever it is to get a food cart started. And to that end, Portland actually ended up translating the food cart license application into something like 30 languages. And that adds so much to the landscape of a city's food, that you could have Cambodian food or, Northeastern Mexican food, all these little niches that wouldn't ever become a brick and mortar. So it adds a great deal to a city's food landscape.
Yeah, Ivy, you nailed it on the head. This is what me and fellow food truck and food cart advocates, preach nationally. I've spoken at more than a few urban planning conferences where these are the urban planners who are planning the next neighborhood in every city or every community, and they all want to incorporate the three things: community gardens, food brings people together; street food, food brings people together; and walking paths, etc. This idea that you're pulling it all, farmers markets, pulling it all together through food. And article came out this week about how city planners of the big cities, Detroit's, the Chicago, etc., they want to start attracting the millennials back into the city because millennials don't want to drive, they don't want to own, etc. Street food is one of the models, including parks, including, good restaurants, affordability of housing. I think one of the keys is we need to get past some of the fears that the restaurateurs have, who may or may not own multiple places, that it's going to hurt their business. Because honestly, last night I ate at a restaurant, because I can go have a beer. You can't really walk up to a food truck and have a beer unless you're, in another country.
I want to take a quick break here to thank our anniversary sponsor, Blossom Brothers. I tasted all 3 Blossom Brothers botanical spritzer flavors again last night. I've tasted them many times, and I can't decide which one is my favorite. You can choose from white peach and jasmine flower, pink grapefruit and honeycomb, and blood orange and ginger root. These spritzers are so refreshing, and they're so delicious with food. They're a blend of white wine, sparkling water, and botanical essences with no sugar added. For our final course, we look at the way in which the legalization of marijuana is shaking up food and beverage culture. I was joined for this episode by Aaron DeJesus, National Reports Editor for Eater.com, and Virginia Ewan, a science journalist covering food issues and farming for publications like Nature, Slate, and Modern Farmer. And once again by Ivy Manning, whose most recent cookbook is Easy Soups from Scratch with Quick Breads to Match. Maybe we should move on to our third topic. Aaron, I saw your byline on an Eater story about marijuana supper clubs. Can you tell us how pot is becoming part of the dining and drinking landscape?
Sure. Well, I think the joking answer is that it has always been part of the landscape, and that chefs, after their long shifts, they go home, they do what they like, and anytime you see any sort of gussied up version of comfort food on an upscale menu, you're really seeing a gussied up version of stoner food that they had made the night before. And several chefs have gone on record to admit to such things. But in terms of that specific story and the idea of marijuana-laced supper clubs popping up, it is supper club, I think, is the sort of correct term there, because I've done a little bit of research, and it is technically not legal to serve marijuana in public spaces, even in states like Colorado and Oregon and Washington, where it is actually legal to use recreationally now. And the chefs who have been doing so have been sort of skirting around this issue by doing so under the guise of private events, which is where pop-ups, which is where supper clubs, which is where ticketed sort of dinner parties are happening. And there is currently, from what I understand, a movement in Denver where they are mulling over an upcoming ballot measure to actually allow people to use and do this in public, in commercial spaces, and in restaurants and bars being among them. But here locally, obviously, marijuana use is now a very new and exciting thing for a lot of people. There have been 2 recent events specifically where chefs and restaurants have served marijuana alongside food. One of them happened in St. John's. The James John Cafe did a private event in July, actually, which they, according to all the materials you can find online, they called a private party, and I'm making quotation marks, a private party with reservations that were available to the public, which is their sort of way of getting the powers that be off their back. The other major event was one sponsored by an alt weekly, here in town, and it happened at Preem, a local pizzeria, where I think the terminology they used was it is a dinner with marijuana sampling available alongside the cost of your ticket. From what I'm seeing, it's certainly not mainstream yet, but it seems like what chefs are doing is actually very similar to what chefs were doing in California when foie gras was very briefly not legal in that state. What chefs would do when they wanted to still serve the delicacy was basically say, oh, well, we're quote unquote giving it away for free with a purchase of this dish. So you would buy your $20 cocktail that just happened to come alongside, with a gift of foie from the chef. So I think that's currently where we're seeing it pop up right now, but I could very certainly be wrong.
Our four-top friend Lucy Birmingham actually went to the Preem dinner, and she said it was very strange. I think maybe the laws you're talking about in Colorado may resolve some of this issue, but she said there was a giant tent wherever it was just kind of a free-for-all. Whatever kind of pot you want to try, go for it. There were all these growers, and then you would have to walk a block to go eat the pizza and drink because the law says that they have to be separated, which is just so weird. I don't know. Ivy, I have a question for you. I keep reading all these articles about how chefs are pairing specific strains with specific foods, and I've been reading these things about wine and pot pairings, which I just drive me completely bonkers because if you're cooking a recipe, does it make a huge difference whether you use Greek oregano or Italian oregano? So isn't marijuana basically just an herb? How can there possibly be a huge difference between these strains?
Oh, gosh. Well, that switches the whole argument now that you put it that way. Because, yes, there is a big difference between Greek oregano and Italian oregano.
Oh, there
and
is?
Mexican oregano.
Oh,
yeah, there is a difference.
shoot.
I mean, I would say I have never cooked with pot in that way where I would be using it to augment something. So I can't really speak to that, I guess. I mean, there are some that are funkier than others, so I'm guessing that you could do it differently. I know that there's a great art in chocolates and elixirs in Colorado, and paired with the right ingredients, you don't taste the pot as much, or it's not as herbal, shall we say.
Oh, so the goal is to not taste it.
Less, yes.
That's sort of an odd...
Right. I'm acquainted with a fellow who owns Incredibles in Colorado, and he infuses with, very scientifically, it's a lab, chocolates, and they're very carefully, the recipes are very carefully developed. So, for instance, there's one that's banana and walnut and single origin chocolate, and so you wouldn't taste the pot as much. It's more the chocolate experience.
I don't get this because... Getting back to oregano, I mean, this is to me, it tastes like not that I've been eating it all day, every day, but to me, the aroma and flavor seems to be herbaceous. Why don't people go savory? What is this whole thing with going with sweet?
That's an interesting question. Yeah, why not? I mean, I've heard tell in college of spaghetti sauce, but so far I have
Come
not.
on, it's legal. You can
so far I have not seen chefs do a whole lot with it, but then again, I'm not really in that world quite yet. So, I mean, it's the Wild West out there with this. So,
you're going to get a magazine editor calling you. I would say, in a year?
High times.
asking for 6 recipes
with millet,
millet and pot. So, Virginia, I have heard that the marijuana farmers, a lot of them are just not taking the environment into account at all. What are you hearing from the farming perspective?
I think the technical term for the amount of pesticides being used on pot farms is a shit ton. I think that bugs and mildew are clearly a big problem on pot farms, and there's no regulation. This is, as Ivy says, Wild West territory. And the feds don't want to deal with legalized pot, so there's absolutely no oversight as far as what pesticides you can and should use. So they're just going at it on their own, and they're throwing anything and everything out there. So because, a lot of it is there's not a big supply, so you don't want anything to happen to your yield, and so you're going to protect it with whatever you have to. But the Oregonian actually did an investigation this summer where they took products off the shelf, tested them, found all kinds of chemicals. I think up to 14 different chemicals, including roach killer on products on the shelf. They detected in 5 different concentrates analyzed over 78 days, they found levels ranging from 40 parts per million to 300 parts per million. And to put that into perspective, the federal government has residue limits on food crops. And so the limits range from 0.02 parts per million for asparagus to 10 parts per million for grapes. So this is off the scale differences. I mean, there's one quote in the Oregonian story that the product that they looked at and tested, it was almost as if the leaves had just been soaked in pesticides. So that's a huge problem and something that people should be aware of.
Wow. Add pot to the things we should feel guilty about ingesting. Oh, no. This is awful. Although I did see a story by Hannah Wallace, who some of us know, on Civilides about an organic cannabis farm here in Canby, Oregon. So,
Sadly, it won't get the organic label. But
it won't? You know about this one?
Well, no, I don't know about that particular bit. I know that, if the feds aren't dealing with pesticide regulations, they're not going to give it an organic label.
Oh, right. Oh, this is terrible, terrible news.
Debbie Downer. Wah, wah.
Well, that's it for today's episode, which was recorded in the high-fiber, protein-packed city of Portland, Oregon at the studios of OPB. You can read all about the Foretop on the OPB website. Our producer is Alex Ward. Special thanks to OPB sound supervisor Stephen Cray. And our theme music was performed by the incomparable wine importer Kermit Lynch. A huge thanks to all the panelists who joined me to record those pilot episodes, especially to Ivy Manning and Laura Russell for joining me twice for 2 different recording sessions, to Alex Ward, our producer, and to Stephen Cray here at OPB. If you like our James Beard Award-winning show, please help us out. Rate us on iTunes, subscribe to The Foretop on your favorite podcast app, and please, please tell your friends about us. You can tweet us at _4top, all one word, or visit our Facebook page and post your thoughts about the show. We would love to hear from you. Bye-bye now.
Nuit blanche, nuit blanche, nuit